Good morning. Let me just say, this morning's been fantastic. And if this video is going to still be available next fall when I teach my graduate seminar, Science and Technology Policy, it's going to be part of my course. 3 great talks. And I am going to try to pick up where Dan left off. And let me just say, for terminology, what he calls a polluted science communication environment, I'm going to use the word politics to describe that. So what I'm going to talk about is what happens when we find ourselves in these situations, you know, with the lines on the graph going in different directions. What should experts do in those contexts? And understanding the different roles and responsibilities of experts is the focus of my talk. And let me say, at the core of this, everything that was said this morning I find a lot to agree with. And what Dan just talked about how we use scientific issues to kind of separate out ourselves, to differentiate in politics. There's a word for that also. Those are called wedge issues. And in our modern politics, what is maybe distinctive is the degree to which science has come to be looked at as a potential source of wedges. Climate change is the most obvious, but there's others also. What is also distinctive is the degree to which experts, academic scientists, willingly participate in that process. Part of it is because science gets greater standing when it's politicized. Academics get greater visibility. And also there are political gains, even if it does pathologize the science communication environment. I'm going to start with a story. I think it's what I call a cautionary tale. This is Ann Glover. For those of you who follow the world of science advice, she was recently relieved of her duties. The European Commission got rid of its science advisory structure in the form of the chief scientific advisor. And GMOs are central to that story. So a few years ago, and those of you who know Anne, she's a fantastic communicator. Everything you would want in a science advisor. Very clear, humorous, engaging, doesn't speak in jargon, very politically sophisticated. She was the chief scientific advisor for Scotland before she went to the European Commission. And if you've seen her talk, she often talks about GMOs. And she has strong opinions based on her professional expertise on the science of GMOs, which, as you know, if it's not a polluted issue in the United States, certainly is in Europe. And she said things like this: by all means, people can say for ethical reasons, for philosophical reasons, for economical reasons, for political reasons, I am not keen on that, meaning GM technology. But you cannot say it's dangerous when it isn't. So soon after that, a member of the European Parliament asked Jose Manuel Barroso, who's the president of the European Commission, do you agree with what your science advisor said? And he put out a statement that said the chief scientific advisor has a purely advisory function and no role in defining commission policies. Therefore, her views do not necessarily represent the views of the commission. All right, so all of a sudden the scientific advisor was talking about science, and then the politician said, pay no attention to that scientist. They play no official role in our decision making. Just what you'd want to hear. Not long after that, less than a year later, a number of NGOs, including some you've probably heard of, Greenpeace among others, invoked this characterization of GM science by Ann Glover and wrote a letter to the incoming president, Juncker, of the European Commission, talking about Glover. To the media, the current chief scientific advisor presented one-sided, partial opinions in the debate on the use of GM organisms in agriculture, repeatedly claiming that there was a scientific consensus about their safety. We hope that you as the incoming commission president, will decide not to nominate a chief scientific advisor, and that instead the commission will take its advice from a variety of independent, multidisciplinary sources with a focus on the public interest. I wonder who that might be. So, President Juncker, when he came in, he junks the chief scientific advisor. Now, whether there's a relationship between the lobbying of the NGOs and Ann Glover's office being terminated, who knows? Just yesterday, I woke up yesterday morning to hear that there's some talk about bringing back the chief scientific advisor in some capacity. But what we had here is a very problematic situation. What should the role of a scientist in a policy position be on a subject like GM technologies or climate change? And one of the problems that I'm going to describe here is that the role of the chief scientific advisor in this case, and generally on these issues, was not formalized, was not prescribed, was not understood. So when Ann Glover said what she said, the context in which it was interpreted was subject to, as we heard this morning, multiple frames depending on where you sit. And the European Commission did not create that framing. So one of the things I'm going to say, and some of my colleagues in the sciences, and I've worked in physical science organizations for 25 years, and I always get people who tell me how much they hate to hear this, but I'm going to say it again. All communication and engagement is political, whether you like it or not. Yes, at the margins, we could talk about the Higgs boson and the cute little rovers on Mars. But once you're talking about what we ought to be doing about X, Y, or Z, you are firmly in the realm of politics. So what I did a few years back was, after just seeing all this wonderful literature in science and technology studies and science technology policy, and working in a day-to-day environment with physical scientists, I thought maybe it would be useful to try to communicate some of what's known in the form of guidelines for experts who have to engage with the public and policymakers. And so I'm going to talk about these different modes of engagement. And the bottom line, it's really important to discuss roles and responsibilities when scientists engage with decision makers and the public. There are multiple possible roles. I will argue there's a finite number of roles. I'll present them as ideal types, and you can change what role you play in the morning to the afternoon. All of them are important to a healthy, functioning democracy. But again, you can't swim without getting wet. The so-called deficit model, this idea, I don't want to engage in politics. I just want to improve the quality of the discourse. I want to elevate scientific understanding. Forget about it. You're not going to do that. That's a recipe to pure politicization of science, kind of in an unknowing fashion. Ultimately, institutions matter. Institutions like the one we're sitting in right now. All right, some definitions, and this is just to show you know what I mean when I use these terms. Science is just a systematic pursuit of knowledge, right? The humanities are in there, CIA analysts, social scientists, physical scientists. A policy is a decision. It's a commitment to a course of action. If there's no choice to be made, there's no decision to be made, you're not engaged in policy. Policy is not necessarily a governmental function. We have personal policies. My university has policies. Businesses have policies. What is politics? Politics is the bargaining, negotiation, and compromise in pursuit of a desired end. Politics, in my view, is a beautiful thing. It's how we get done the business of living together in society. It often has a pejorative tone when we talk about politics, especially in this town. But if you put all these words together, we talk about the politicization of science. That's simply the use of the systematic pursuit of knowledge as a means of bargaining, negotiating, and compromising in pursuit of a desired end. It's not bad. We want science to be politicized. We want science tightly integrated with politics, at least those of us who believe in the values of the Enlightenment and the idea that knowledge and science can help us make better decisions. There is, of course, the pathological politicization of science. That's what we have to watch out for, and I'll talk a bit about that. All right, so in a nutshell, this is the framework I present in The Honest Broker. So let's say I show up from Boulder, Colorado, in Washington, D.C., hypothetically speaking. I'm the decision maker. You're the expert. If you're local, you're truly an expert. And the question is where to have dinner tonight. This is a hypothetical question because my dinner will be served by United Airlines. But let's say I was having dinner in Washington. How might our engagement take place? I'll give you four modes of engagement. In the book, I talk in terms of the theoretical background. I won't go into that in any detail, but let me just say that these are shaped by how we think about democracy, and we all have thoughts about how democracy ought to work, whether we are aware of that or not, or whether we express that or not, and also this view of science and society. The linear model, the deficit model on the one hand, and the stakeholder engagement model on the other, to come up with these four ideal types: the pure scientist, the issue advocate, the science arbiter, and the honest broker of policy alternatives. Let me go through each. So you might say to me, I don't want anything to do with your values-based decisions about food. I'm going to give you, fortunately, the FDA has this dietary guidelines for Americans, and I'll give this to you, and this will empower you to make decisions about what to eat for dinner. You might think this is the pure scientist. This approach has been critiqued. The dietary guidelines for Americans includes meat. for example. You don't have to eat meat to have a healthy diet. Should it be included? Well, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is responsible for promoting the economic fortunes of the food producers, including meat producers. So maybe it's not as pure as you might think. The only way that pure science exists, I would argue, is if Bill Gates gives you a grant, big grant, you go to a desert island, you cut your internet connection, and you follow your curiosity. The minute you engage with the public, with policymakers, you're no longer a pure scientist. So really the action, at least insofar as today's discussion, is in the three other groups. All right, one mode is the science arbiter, which is like the concierge at my hotel. I could go to the concierge and ask questions that can be resolved empirically. Could you tell me the 3 closest Italian restaurants? Could you recommend a sports bar that shows English Premier League soccer? The idea there is that there's an expert, there's a decision maker, the decision maker drives a discourse, but ultimately it's co-produced. The National Academy of Sciences, its National Research Council, has hundreds of committees that serve as science arbiters where members of Congress ask questions and the experts are expected to report back. Now this too has been probably the most thoroughly critiqued mode of engagement. Sheila Jasanoff, The Fifth Estate, her book critiques how we put these together. There's a lot of questions about conflict of interest and bias and so on, but it's something that often we do well, sometimes we find to be problematic. The key there, though, is a formal engagement between the decision maker and the expert. That was lacking in the issue of GMOs and Glover in the European Commission. No one asked her to talk about GMOs. No one asked her to put together an assessment panel. Where did those views come from? Why were they legitimate? They were fair questions because there was no institutionalized mechanism for eliciting that advice. All right, you might be an issue advocate. You might tell me to go to dinner at McDonald's. You might, like McDonald's, have stock in the company. Your niece works there. The defining characteristic of advocacy is trying to reduce the scope of choice of a decision maker. Advocacy is fundamental to American democracy. It goes back to James Madison in the Federalist Papers, where we talked about factions. It's a noble calling. Washington, D.C. is full of advocates. People who tell you that we should label GM foods are advocates. People who tell you we shouldn't are advocates. And a lot of times science gets enlisted in advocacy campaigns because of its, as we saw this morning, high standing among the public. It'd be great to have a leading scientist with the gray hair, the glasses, the lab coat, telling you what you ought to do. But the key there is reducing the scope of choice. Now contrast that with what I call the honest broker of policy alternatives. That's like a travel guide, right? Someone could say, well, I'm not going to tell you what restaurant to do, but I can tell you what your choices are. And even here, the idea of honest brokering, if you gave me the yellow pages of all the restaurants in the Washington, D.C. area, by the time I studied it and did a thorough investigation, I'd probably starve to death. So think of it as a spectrum between advocacy, telling me to go to McDonald's, and giving me the yellow pages. There are shades of gray there, but there's a big difference, I would argue, between you as the expert giving me a map where the McDonald's are and giving me a travel guide. Those are the 4 idealized modes of engagement. Last year, University College London put out a guide to science communication in the climate change area, and they used this framework, and they said, but Pielke forgot one. That's the science communicator. That's the communicator who doesn't want to be involved in politics, only wants to elevate the quality of the debate. Doesn't exist. No, there's no such thing. What does happen is that we pretend that we're pure scientists or merely science arbiters. We're just talking about the facts. But in reality, what's going on is an effort to use science to try to motivate a particular set of decisions, or often a particular decision. I've done a lot of research in the climate change area, and this problem of stealth issue advocacy is endemic there. People assert they want to talk about the science, but they're really trying to do is to compel some sort of action. I find that stealth issue advocacy is particularly pathological in this area. So this is what Ann Glover was accused of, that she was engaging in stealth issue advocacy. She was saying, no, I'm only talking about the science. But when that was received in a polluted science communication environment, depending on where you sat on GM technology issues in Europe, you would interpret her as a shill for industry or a noble scientist speaking the truth. But the fact that there was no formal institutionalized framework for eliciting and receiving that advice meant that that just became a political football, and ultimately she's headed back to Scotland now. Now in the book I talk in some detail about the different ways we might assess what role might make the most sense in what context. And let me say again, each of these four roles are fundamentally important to the healthy functioning of expertise in a democracy. And each one of us as experts has to make a decision about what role we want to play. It's really hard, and I would say often impossible, for the individual to play the role of the honest broker. All of us have our biases, our backgrounds, our narrow specialized expertise. The honest broker role is best served by diverse committees of experts in authoritative, legitimized institutions like the National Academy of Sciences. One of the most significant pathologies in the science advice world is when these institutions who are highly respected jump into the advocacy realm. There's no shortage of advocates. And when an organization like the National Academies or the Royal Society in the UK or the AAAS or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change decides they want to put their thumb on the scale one way or another, it can be very damaging to their legitimacy because we don't have many organizations that can play the role of honest broker. If you want a good practical example of what an honest broker is, think about Expedia or the travel websites. If you want to know your options for flying from Denver to Washington or whatever, go to the website and they tell you what your options are. They don't tell you where you should go. They don't tell you what airline to fly. They'll tell you the dates, the costs. They give you options. When Expedia was first live as a website and it was discovered that they were promoting certain airlines because they were getting paid, it was a big scandal. They stopped that right away. They lost legitimacy because they were seen as putting their thumb on the scale. So now they play it straight. It's a lot more difficult to do that, obviously, in science areas. The criteria that I use in thinking about context of decision making are the degree of values consensus and the presence of uncertainty. Someone asked earlier today, this is the dimensions of post-normal science. What I've given you is a framework for action for experts in the context of post-normal science. And I use a language to try to help explain why context matters. So there's one set of issues where we negotiate, we discuss, that I call abortion politics. And this is a lack of agreement on ends or means or unmanageable uncertainties. This is a particularly US centric description. If we were in Europe, I might call it GM politics, for instance. But it's where information really doesn't matter unless it's symbolic or invoked to support positions that are already held. I contrast this with what I call tornado politics. So imagine we're in this room, it's the rare day that a tornado is approaching Washington, D.C. We have to make a decision. We could say very obviously and straightforward that the science will dictate our decision. Right? If the tornado is headed towards this building, we're going to some shelter or the basement or whatever. But it's easy to fool ourselves into thinking that science dictates that decision. Science is able to dictate that decision because we all have the same values. We don't want to die. Right? So it's very easy to get a bit of information, look on the radar, is the storm coming, and that filters into a preferred option. So when there's agreement or ends or means in manageable uncertainties, we're in the realm of tornado politics. Now, tornado politics, I would argue, are fairly unique in the political sphere. If an issue is resolvable by data, facts, or evidence, it will be resolved by data, facts, or evidence, and we won't argue about it. Sure, we'll have technical disputes and so on. Well, is the radar signature suggest it's really coming or not really coming? There are other issues. Climate change, where there's high conflict in values, tremendous uncertainties. Economic growth, where we seem to like that, but there's a lot of uncertainties about how it occurs. These are in a class of what are called wicked problems. They're problems that don't have an easy solution, sometimes no solution at all. what we do often in our discussions of science and decision-making science and politics is we try to frame our wicked problems as tame problems. Yes, if only people understood the science of climate change, we would all agree to an agreement in Paris coming up later this year. It's just as obvious as the approaching tornado. There's an approaching disaster 75 years, 100 years from now, and if only people would see that, they would metaphorically go to the shelter. The reality is that wicked problems are wicked problems for a reason, and an effort to reframe them as tame problems is an invitation to the sort of stealth advocacy I mentioned before. The idea that we can use science to reach political consensus without recognizing at the exact same time it's a lot easier to use science as a wedge issue. We can pollute that environment in which decisions take place. Now, this is an extremely frustrating thing, I know, for many experts who say, well, I don't want to get into the politics, the economics, the cultural dimensions of this issue. I just want the discussion to be more science-based. I guess one of the things I'm going to say is, I'm sorry. I wish it was that way also, but efforts to insert science to try to make a wicked problem tame often have the effect of increasing the nature of the pollution in that environment. It makes things worse. So the deficit model, this idea that if only we had more or better facts in the discussion, it has a tremendous pull on all of us. We have this rational idea of decision-making, the values of the Enlightenment. And if you look at these debates on the issues, the fracking issue, the climate change issue, the GM issue in Europe, there is this underlying view, particularly among leaders in scientific institutions, that it is really just about getting the facts right. On many of these issues, I don't even think it's possible to separate out, this is the fact component, this is the values component. They're all wrapped up together. That's why it's so very important to have institutions like the National Academy of Sciences who can create panels of experts to come up with legitimized views on here's the state of the science. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change got into some trouble in 2007. Many of you may have heard of its error with respect to glaciers. In 2035, had a lot of other problems. It did a much better job in its most recent report. Its most recent report was talked about a lot less than that earlier report, which kind of jumped into the advocacy realm. I think one of the things we have to understand as experts is that if you believe in democracy, in the sense that people have some say in decisions, that they may make decisions differently than experts would. And we all have to come to some degree of peace with that or not. But the reality is that sometimes science plays a very small role in the decisions that we make involving putatively scientific topics. It's important to recognize that public opinion is only indirectly related to policy. So here's recent data on 3 different topics: physician-assisted euthanasia, same-sex marriage, and marijuana legislation. If you came here from Mars and you were to ask which one of these is most broadly accepted in the United States, and which one is not, public opinion would not be a particularly good guide. Policy can encourage stealth advocacy. This is a great example of what we saw this morning. So in my courses, I often do an assignment focused on the Preble's jumping mouse. Has anyone heard of the Preble's jumping mouse? All right, yeah, a few people. The Preble's jumping mouse is a little tiny critter that lives in the Front Range of Colorado and Wyoming. And it, for many years, has been the subject of debate as to whether it should be protected under the Endangered Species Act. And in my courses, I introduce the topic the same way I just did here. How many people have heard of it? And, a couple people. It's in Colorado. And I ask, how many of you think it should be protected? All the hands go up, right? How many people think they wouldn't? A few more. Everybody has an opinion. So what I do is I ask the students in groups to put together a National Academy of Sciences panel on the Preble's jumping mouse, because the key question here is whether it actually exists. You can see it exists, but is it a distinct subspecies? Or is it like a bigger family of mice? Because if it's a distinct subspecies, then it falls under the provisions of the Endangered Species Act, and it ought to be protected. If it's like all these other mice, then there's billions of them, so it doesn't need to be protected. So there's a debate over whether it's a distinct subspecies or not. So I asked the students, your job is to put together an expert panel, a science arbitration panel, to answer the question. So I'm the member of Congress, and I say, tell me, what's the science say? Is this a distinct subspecies or not? So I can make my decision under the Endangered Species Act. Now, what the students do, inevitably, there's only about a dozen people worldwide who have expertise in mouse DNA of this type, is they find the experts, and then they start Googling them. What are their views on the Endangered Species Act? Who have they given money to in campaigns? Some students will stack a panel based on this information. Some try to balance it out. But none of them ignore that information. Now, I'm sure this never happens in the National Academy of Sciences, but the problem here is not the empanelment process. It's that the fundamental nature of the policy, the Endangered Species Act, forces a decision point based on science that, at least according to the experts, is to some degree uncertain. Right? So that encourages us to say this science is right, this science is wrong, when we're really saying something about species protection. So if we want to unpollute that environment, it has nothing to do with coming up with the truth. It has to do with going back to the original formulation of a policy that forced a decision that science is really not prepared to make. It's a political decision. I can give you countless examples of that. Politicians love science. So this is John Gummer, who in the UK, in the early years when there was worry about mad cow disease, said, based on what he read in Nature, that the food supply was safe. He went on TV with his daughter eating a hamburger. Of course, as we now know, that was a colossal error. Jacob Creutzfeldt disease was real, and there was problems in the meat supply in the UK because they were feeding cattle parts to cattle. But in that case, science was wrong. But politicians, in this case, illustrating the importance of science, told the public they could trust them. Sometimes politicians love science too much. This is an example I use a lot. This is Bill Foster, who's in Congress now. During the time that he was out of office, I was on a panel with him with AAAS on responsible research practices. Just think about that for a second. And he talked about what he called pre-distortion. And this was a panel for young scientists. And these are my notes from the time I put up on my blog. Foster said that scientists should expect that the information they bring to the political process, such as through testimony before congressional committees, will inevitably be distorted in the political process. It's those nasty Republicans, those nasty Democrats, whoever's on the other side, they're going to distort it. He then raised what he called a difficult ethical question. If a scientist knows that their message will be distorted in the political process, to what degree should she or he pre-distort their message in hopes that what comes out the other end is a closer approximation to reality? So what he said is, if you know the truth, the answer is 0, and yet others are saying it's 5, should you really go before Congress and just say it's -5 so that things cancel out in the process? This is the environment that experts have to swim in. It's well known that the scientific community has its own political leanings. In general, this is a survey of AAAS members. Matt Nisbet has written on this, as has Dan Sarowitz. Is that a feature or a flaw? Is that something we have to consider as the scientific community is putting together panels, advice, and so on? All right, so let me conclude. Modes of science engagement. It's important to discuss roles and responsibilities. And again, what I would say to you is it doesn't matter where you end up. As long as we well populate those 4 boxes and stay away from stealth advocacy, then the important thing is the discussion of modes of engagement. Don't pretend that there's an out. Well, I like, those 4 things that Pielke presented, those were cute and all. I'm just a science communicator. No. There are multiple possible roles. All of them are important, and you can't swim without getting wet. If you're going to engage, you are engaged in politics. So it's important to be politically sophisticated. And of course, institutions matter. I'd love to hear from you, and I think it's time for lunch, so thank you very much.